As nice as it is to be able to log on to a wireless network simply and easily because it's an open network, or to have the relatively easy configuration of clients using pre-shared keys, what really makes sense for most of our enterprise customers is going to be to utilize Extensible Authentication Protocol as it works to allow for connections based upon 802.1x. In other words, log on based upon a user account. Have a defined database of users and allow that database of users to be what allows access. The great thing then is that those who have an account will have access. Those who don't are not able to have access. And instead of having to change the key for everyone if someone leaves or no longer needs access, of course, all we need to do is disable that user account and voila, right? That's taken care of. So what we're going to see is the process of setting this up so that we are enabling user-based access, identifying a user account that is based upon a local EAP profile is going to be a series of steps involved defining the local user accounts, and then defining what's called a method list for authentication and authorization, and then binding that to our wireless LAN, telling it to use this type of authentication process. So let's take a look at the big bold steps here. We're in configuration, we're looking at security, and you'll see that under AAA, we have radius configuration, and we can configure users. Now, when we think about radius configuration, right, most of the time what we're thinking of is being able to forward data to a radius server like ICE. But in this case, we're talking about local authentication and building a defined local account. So you can see we have defined a local username, privilege, password, and what type of user account it is. All right, so we've got those basic principles defined here. Now that we've got our user accounts, right, wash, rinse, repeat for all the users that you need to build. Then we come over here and we'll see below the AAA section, we have local EAP and local EAP profiles. And that's what we want to define because we're going to be using WPA, WPA2 with 802.1x based upon local user authentication at the wireless LAN controller. So what we'll need to define are profiles, and then we'll bind those profiles to the actual wireless LAN. So you see in this case, we've come up with a local EAP profile. We've come up with a profile name. In this case, it's called Switch Local EAP. And we've enabled the protocols that we want to support. In this case, it's protected EAP. Great choice, only requires a server-side certificate. From there, in that method list, then we go in a little bit deeper and we'll need to configure, in addition to those general properties we were looking at, the authentication, possibly accounting and authorization components. So again, we have this idea of a method list name. In this case, it's called AuthentList for the authentication portion. And we're going to use .1x, and it's local, right? Because that's what we're focusing on, is local logon based upon this process. Then that's the authentication. Again, as we continue over to the authorization side of it, for authorization, the method list, we see that we have this author list, method list identifier. We're using a credential download. This is going to be essentially what is it allowed to do? It's allowed to grab its credentials, right? That's all we're specifying at this point, again, from the local system, right? Not pulling from a remote radius server. Over here under general, we'll see that, again, we've got .1x system authentication control enabled. We're using method list. This is the method list we're using. We're using for authorization method list, and this is the method list we're using. We're not using a remote AAA server. So all of this is specified centrally in the security section under AAA, but then you get to your wireless LAN. And this is where, of course, the rubber meets the road. Like an access control list, it's great to build a list, but it only has purpose once it's applied. So we see over here that we have WPA plus WPA2, but then instead of specifying that we want to use a pre-shared key, instead we're saying in this policy that we would like to use 802.1x. Then when we go to our security and we're managing our 802.1x configuration, we can point to AAA server, and this is going to be where we define our EAP profile name that we would like to use, right? So this is going to be what creates that connection to the method lists that are defined within it. So local EAP authentication based upon this EAP profile. That'll be what we're utilizing right there. And so this gets us local account authorization defined. So I don't have to necessarily have a centralized server in order to manage this. What would this look like in terms of a command line configuration in the CLI? Well, it would look very similar. We might do something like this. In order to configure a username, define the name of the user. It could be Bob. In this case, I've got converged user, conv user, and with their password. Then we would need to also, of course, create that profile, right? That EAP profile that we want to specify there. So again, give it a name. In this case, EAP profile, called it PEEP profile, method PEEP, right? That's just like checking off this list here. When we get to configuring our lists, we can specify that pretty easily. We're going to be using a series of AAA commands. All right, so that's our context, just like we saw before. So AAA authentication.1x method list 1. So we create a method list, and it's called method list 1. So this is where we're actually creating it, and it's a local method list, right? We're not pointing to a remote device. AAA Authorization Network method list 1 local. So again, using the same name there. That's fine. So we use different names as we were configuring the two different method lists in the graphical environment. Using the same name here works fine because we end up specifying both. AAA Authorization Credential Download method list 1 local. So again, saying we're going to use credential download in this method list. This method list is a local method list. And then AAA Local Authentication Method List 1, Authorization Method List 1. This is where we basically put it all together and say, here's the practice that we're actually specifying for this configuration. Then we get to kind of the high-level controls, those last pieces there. And we will use, actually the command is .1x system-auth-control. And that's an enable-disable feature, so turning that on enables .1x system authentication control to allow for local authentication, so that enables that feature there. And then the last piece is, again, it's in the configuration of the wireless LAN. So again, here we've got a wireless LAN called WLAN authlan, and it happens to be number 6. Local authentication based upon that PEEP profile. Security.1x authentication list, there it is, method list 1. And then, of course, we assign it a VLAN and no shutdown so that it's able to execute. So this is where we bind it to, again, the PEEP profile for a protected EAP and the authentication list that will allow for us to validate them based upon the local user account configured on the wireless LAN controller. Voila, you've got local EAP.